Welcome to Down the Dopamine Hole, where random subjects are forced to hold hands until they get along and then tied together with a psychological concept, which pretty much describes the inside of my brain 24/7. The first disaster broadcast was actually a radio broadcast, and it happened on May 7th, 1937, and it was the Hindenburg disaster. There was a WLS radio broadcaster from Chicago named Herb Morrison, and he planned on recording the Hindenburg landing. Except the landing, as we all know, did not exactly go to plan. After he recorded the disaster, he immediately flew back to Chicago and the recording was played the next day. A lot of people thought that it was a live broadcast. It actually wasn't, but it was listened to by millions of people throughout the world, and it has been listened to by millions more since then. There was also a film that was recorded of the broadcast, but the film was actually recorded without sound. Later, the film and the audio recording were put together into what we are the most familiar with.
It bursts into flames. Get it started. Get it started. It's fighting and it's crashing. It's crashing terrible. Oh my! Get out of the way, please. It's burning, bursting into flames, and it's falling on the mooring mast and all the folks between it. This is terrible. This is one of the worst catastrophes in the world. Oh, it's like 20, 400 or 500 feet into the sky, and it's a terrific crash, ladies and gentlemen. The smoke and the flames now, and the flame is crashing to the ground, not quite to the mooring mast. Oh, the humanity.
This broadcast was the most famous and first breaking news broadcast in radio history. The first live television disaster broadcast happened on April 9th, 1949. A 3-year-old girl named Kathy Fiscus fell down into a well. She was in that well for 28 hours, and her rescue was actually broadcast live. They broke into the programmed show to show her rescue live. This was in California, and in the LA area at that time, there were about 10,000 TV sets. People gathered at other people's homes to watch the rescue. Most people, when they watched TV, actually watched through store windows. There were eyewitnesses that said that there were hundreds of people gathered in front of store witnesses to watch this rescue. About 10,000 people actually were gathered at the site of her rescue to watch the rescue in person. That's how big of a deal this was. Unfortunately, Kathy did not live throughout this ordeal, and she could not be rescued successfully. Those of you that are in my generation, Generation X, by the way, remember that 38 years later, there was another child that fell into a well. Her name was Jessica McClure. We knew her as baby Jessica, and this happened in October of 1987. This was the first live broadcast that followed an event in its entirety. Jessica McClure was in a well for 58 hours, and there was live news coverage of the entire 58 hours. This was the first time that this had ever happened. Over 50 million people watched this at some point during the 58 hours, and over 3 million people watched at the moment of her rescue. Thankfully, Jessica was rescued successfully. But this was a landmark event in TV broadcasting. In January and February of 1991, the Gulf War was happening, and we had American reporters for CNN in Baghdad. Up until this point, Iraq had invaded Kuwait, and that's what the American reporters were reporting on. However, in January of 1991, the American government decided that they were going to bomb Iraq. And the American reporters were there, and they covered this live. This was the first time that any type of wartime activity had ever been covered live on the news. Yes, we had seen film of wartime activity, but you have to understand that that film had been edited and seen way after the fact. People's fascination with the sounds and the visions of war, they were almost unquenchable. I remember this, and I remember sitting at night just watching the war. Up until this point, when reporters reported on things, it was always the edited version. You saw reporters being unflappable. Nothing bothered them. But then we have these reporters, these American reporters in Baghdad that were scared. You could tell they were scared. You could hear it in their voices. You could see it in their faces. And this was new. This was the first time that we actually thought of reporters being in danger. After seeing reporters in harm's way and continuing to report live, this changed everything for TV broadcasting. It also changed everything for those of us who were watching. It changed our expectations. We now had the expectation that we were going to have up to the minute coverage of every major event that happened. Weather events, riots, bombings, school shootings, any major event that happened. We didn't really think about the danger that these reporters were in. And if we did, I think it kind of added to the appeal of these live broadcasts. We not only now have live news coverage of disaster events, but we now have a ton of documentaries and shows that focus exclusively on disasters. We wouldn't have these shows, we wouldn't have these documentaries if there wasn't an audience for them. So, what is it about these disaster events that fascinates us so much to the point of where so many people watch them? What is it about these things that keeps bringing us back for more? One of the reasons why we watch disaster documentaries is it teaches us what we should do in similar situations. We learn, for example, what people who survive do and the decisions that they make. We learn people who don't survive, what are the decisions that they make. And one of the things that this does for us is it teaches us if we are ever in this situation, what should we do? And a perfect example of this, when you get on an airplane and they tell you as they're going through their safety thing, in the case of a water landing, we all know what a water landing means, right? In the case of a water landing, do not inflate your life jacket until you are out of the plane. The reason for that is this. In the case of a water landing, the plane will actually fill up with water very quickly. And if you inflate your life vest prior to getting out of the plane, you're not going to be able to get out of the plane because you're going to be pushed against the top of the plane because you float. You cannot swim underwater with an inflated life vest to get out of the plane. Leave it uninflated so you can swim underwater, get out of the plane, get to the surface, and then inflate it. But most people don't think about it and they think, no, I have to inflate it because we're going into water. That is a very bad idea. We learn based on the choices that people make and the choices that people don't make. Disaster shows, they show people at their best. We not only see first responders who are heroes, absolutely heroes, but we also see a lot of people who are involved in the disasters and what they do to help the people around them. And not only that, but we see people who witness disasters. We see people who are not even involved in these disasters. And very often they will run into the disaster to help people. We get to see average people do extraordinary things. Not only does it make us feel good because we realize that there's really good people in the world, but it also makes us hope that if we were ever in that situation, maybe, just maybe, we would be that person too. Another reason why we like disaster shows, disaster documentaries, live news coverage is it really does test our morals. We have to understand, and I think we do when we watch a lot of these things, that these situations aren't just black and white. There's a lot of gray areas in there. It's if you're going to help people, at what point Do you stop helping? Because if you continue to help people, you're not going to survive. It's what kind of help do you offer? What kind of help do you not offer? How much of what you have can you give to someone else before it becomes detrimental to yourself? There's some very gray areas there, and it really does test our own morals. How far would I go if I were in that situation? There's people that have been in extremely desperate situations that have done things that we might think, oh, I could never do that. But then you kind of have to stop and think, what would I be willing to do if it actually involved me saving my own life? There's a lot of moral dilemmas that we think about when we watch these kinds of things. Another reason why we like to learn about different disaster scenarios is because disasters build community. Disasters bring people together. We always see or hear about when disasters happen, those people who become really selfish or the crimes that happen after disasters, because those are better news stories. They're more sensational. They make people watch more. What we don't always hear about, though, is the people that come together and help each other. We don't hear about the people that go and check on their neighbors that they really don't know to make sure that their neighbors are okay. Or we don't always hear about the people that go and volunteer time to help clean up or help rebuild or whatever the case may be. Disasters really do bring people together. They foster a sense of community in a society that is incredibly individualistic. There's something that are called superordinate goals. Superordinate goals are goals that we have to work together to achieve. Things like cleaning up after disaster, for example, or rebuilding after a disaster, or even if there's a missing person in a community, people come together and they will spend days searching for a missing person. What's very interesting about superordinate goals, not only do they bring us together, but they actually tend to decrease the differences between people. We know that superordinate goals tend to decrease prejudices because once you bring people together with a common goal and you make the most important thing to people achieving this goal, people don't pay so much attention to things like individual differences or maybe how prior to engaging in this superordinate goal, I didn't necessarily like this type of person so much. Superordinate goals are just great ways to not only foster community, to get people to achieve things that they couldn't achieve on their own, but also to bring people together that normally wouldn't otherwise have been brought together. Thinking about disasters and thinking about how fascinated we are with disasters made me think about something that's slightly different, but kind of has a lot of the same characteristics, and that is true crime. It is another thing that we are very fascinated with. Some of the reasons are very similar, but some of the reasons are very different. Here's some of the reasons that we are fascinated with true crime that are very similar in the reasons that we are fascinated with disaster videos. Like catastrophes, true crime helps us to figure out what we would do if we were in a similar situation. When we listen to victim stories, they teach us how to survive. They teach us what we should or shouldn't do in a situation. So we look at what decisions did these victims make that helped them to survive the situation that they were in? What decisions did victims make that they didn't survive? These are all things that we pay attention to when we watch true crime because we think about what would I do in that situation or what should I do in that situation. By listening to stories of true crime, we hear stories of determination. We hear stories of unwillingness to give up. And we hear stories of people who survive their situation. It gives us motivation to think that if we were ever in that situation, we would need to hold on to that same unwillingness to give up and to that same level of determination. Another reason why we kind of watch or listen to both is because we all have a dark side. We kind of have a morbid curiosity or fascination with things that are dark. And listening to catastrophes and true crime kind of satisfies that need. They allow us to fill that need, but in a socially acceptable way. It's kind of like Halloween. It's kind of cool to walk around all bloody on October 31st, but it's not really cool to walk around all bloody in the middle of July. It's kind of like that. Watching catastrophe scenarios or listening to true crime podcasts, it allows us to let our dark side out and play, but in a way that people understand and that people are not going to freak out about. And not only in a way that's socially acceptable, but in a way that often we can connect with other people because we can find people that like the same things that we do and we can talk to them about it. It is pretty cool to watch true crime and catastrophe videos and find somebody to talk to about that. It's not generally really cool to bring up mass murder at a dinner party. Another way that they are very similar is they both allow us to process fear and anxiety in a very safe and controlled environment. Our day to day lives tend to get pretty routine. We like to experience heightened emotions, especially fear, but we don't really like to experience fear in situations in which we have no control. We want these heightened emotions, but we want to have a say over how they happen and when they happen and how severely we experience the heightened emotions. And watching things that evoke these heightened emotions in the safety of our own home is a great way to do that. The physiological response to fear is very similar to sexual arousal. Think about it: increased heart rate, increased respiration, increased blood flow, increased oxygenation to the muscles. That's all very similar to sexual arousal. There is a reason why people like to be scared, as long as they know that they're really safe. People love to do things like go bungee jumping, go skydiving, go through haunted houses. By the way, people tend to have sex more after they do all of those things, so you're welcome. People love to feel those things, and there's reasons for that. There's also reasons why people like to have sex. It is a pleasurable experience to feel those fear responses as long as it's in a very controlled way. If you really think about it, by watching something that is life threatening, especially when people actually survive the event, we get to experience that with them. And in some ways, we pretty much get to cheat death. And that's really cool. So there's some reasons why we are fascinated with true crime that are different than reasons that we are fascinated with catastrophes. One is that it helps us figure out where our threats are. True crime is consumed by women at a higher rate than it is men. And one of the reasons for that is because women tend to be victims at higher rates than men. So for women, consuming true crime allows us to figure out where our threats are. We learn, where do women tend to get victimized, when, at what time of day, what are they doing, that type of thing. It allows us to be more cognizant of where the threats are going to come from. There was research done where researchers talked with men who were incarcerated, who were convicted of crimes against women. And they wanted to find out from men how they chose their victims. What they did is they videotaped women walking from behind. And they did this with quite a few women. And some of the women had actually been victimized before, and some of the women had not. They asked them, if you were to pick any women to victimize, which women would you choose? All of them, almost to a T, chose the women that had been victimized before. When they asked the men why, what did you pick up on? What do you look for? This is what they said. When walking, the women that they chose tended to have a gait that was not as regular. Their stride length was not as regular. What they found is with victims is they tend to walk more with their feet in front of each other. It's almost like they try to walk smaller, like they try to take up less space. Women who have been victims tend to hunch their shoulders more. They tend to walk with their head down. But women who have not been victims they have that kind of wider gait. They also tend to have a more even stride length. They tend to stand up straight. They tend to have their shoulders back. They tend to have their heads up, and they tend to look around more at what's going on around them. So, understanding these things and watching true crime or listening to true crime and hearing things like this gives women an idea of, okay, this is how I need to act. This is what I need to make sure to do. This kind of stuff is why we consume true crime, because it lets us know how to not be victims. Another reason why we are fascinated with true crime is we like to see justice prevail. There is actually something that is called the just world hypothesis. And the just world hypothesis says that good things should happen to good people and bad things should happen to bad people. And we like that. Unfortunately, that doesn't always happen. When it doesn't happen, it makes us very frustrated because it means that the world doesn't make sense. So when we consume true crime and the bad guys get bad things that happen to them, that to us fits with that just world hypothesis and it makes sense. And we like that. We like to see justice prevail. We like it when the victim survives and the victim recovers and the bad guy goes to jail. It makes us feel good. We also get to solve puzzles. We like solving puzzles. At least some of us do. It's actually called the need for cognition. You guys are getting lots of psychological terms today. It's called the need for cognition. And people that have a high need for cognition are people that really like to think. We like to think about things that are challenging. We like to do logic puzzles. We like to try to figure things out. We like to problem solve. It's all of these things that are very intellectually challenging. People that have a very high need for cognition are people that are going to like true crime because they're going to want to figure out like the who done it before they're given the answer. We're also the ones that tend to talk to the screen and be like, "You idiot, don't you know that you're never supposed to fill in the blank?" But talking to yourself, by the way, is also a very ADHD trait, so that might just be me. When I was thinking about processing emotions in a very safe and controlled environment, one of the things that came to me is something that's not entirely new, but being used more and more, and that is using virtual reality for psychological treatment. It's been used for a little while in terms of PTSD, but it's being used more and more for things outside of just PTSD. What happens in terms of PTSD is virtual reality is being used in order to basically expose someone to the traumatic environment in a very safe, controlled way, and generally at increasing intensity. So, starting off with a very, very, very decreased intensity so that they can process their anxiety in a really safe, controlled environment so that they can learn to deal with the triggers that actually trigger the PTSD. They're doing it in this virtual reality. And they found that it's extremely effective. There's a couple different ways that they actually use VR in psychological treatment. One is the exposure therapy, like I just explained with PTSD. One is they use avatars to show potential futures. They will use avatars where they will show somebody what their future will look like if they do not stop a negative behavior, and then what their future could look like if they do stop a negative behavior. Another way that they use VR is skills training. So they might have somebody, for example, who has a lot of social anxiety. They might have them in a VR world go into a social environment where they can then practice social skills. They can practice, communication. They can practice in a way, still basically an exposure therapy because it's in a way in which they are able to process their anxiety in a very safe, controlled environment, but they're also able to practice the skills that they need in order to successfully navigate that environment. That's the basically three ways that VR is being used in psychological treatment. So not only are they using it for PTSD, they are also using it for phobias. which is another example of exposure therapy. In terms of the avatars, where they do the avatar and they have the person see what it would be like if they don't stop a negative behavior versus if they do stop a negative behavior. They've done this several ways, but they have done it with eating disorders. They found about a 50% success rate in doing this, which is not great because that's about equal to other types of therapy. And considering that VR therapy is not available in every therapist's office, and considering that it's pretty equal to other types of therapies, it's not like VR would be a really good treatment for eating disorders. They have done this with substance abuse, and they found amazing success rates. They found about 85% success rates in people getting clean and sober and staying that way, as opposed to about 50% success rates in other types of therapy. And what they have found is that when the person continues with the VR therapy, so they get to go in and they get to have their avatar continue to live that clean and sober life, that tends to even be more effective in making sure that they stay clean and sober. In terms of skills training, there's a lot of different things that they've done. Things like people with autism, they can have them practice job interviewing, which may be difficult. Like I said, people with social phobias, they can put them into different types of social interactions. We know that disaster videos, we know that true crime allows people to process those emotions in that safe environment. We know VR helps people process emotions in that safe environment. Do these things actually help people with self-regulation? Self-regulation, figured I should probably describe that before we go into it. Self-regulation of emotions is basically your ability to be aware of your emotions, monitor your emotions, edit them, manage them, think before you act, control your behavior, and basically not have to do the whole apology tour later. If you guys have ever had to do the apology tour later, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And basically stop screwing up all of your relationships. Because if you do not have the ability to be aware of, manage, edit, control your behavior, and think before you act, you will screw up all of your relationships. Trust me. Does watching disaster videos, does watching true crime, does doing VR therapy, does that help with self-regulation? That was my question after going through all of this. The answer to that is kind of and yes, because it can never be yes and no, right? Research shows that interacting with disaster media and true crime media can help with self-regulation. However, of course, there's a however, and this is where that kind of came from. However, this is only true when it comes to stress and anxiety. This is not true when it comes to other emotions that need to be self-regulated, like anger, frustration, guilt, loneliness, shame, whatever else you need to learn how to self-regulate. It does nothing for those emotions. There's another however. However, this also tends to work only when these things are consumed in moderation and when they are either read or listened to, but not when they are watched. The reason for this is because when they are watched, video tends to focus on the sensationalizing of it, and it tends to focus on the goriness of it. That does not help decrease anxiety and stress. It tends to increase it. There's another, however, and it's if you consume it at night before you go to bed, which most people do. You have to remember that when we go to sleep, one of the things that REM sleep does is REM tends to process the things that happen to us during the day, and it tends to store memories. And the thing that you do right before you go to sleep is definitely going to get processed during REM sleep. So if what you do right before you go to sleep is watch things that are very emotionally disturbing, that is going to affect what happens when you sleep. Does disaster media and true crime media help you self-regulate? Kind of. What about virtual reality? Not just regular virtual reality that you guys go out and buy, but I'm talking actual virtual reality in psychological treatment. What about that? There was research done on 800 adolescents, and not adolescents that were diagnosed with psychological disorders, just regular old adolescents. They gave 400 of them VR training, and they gave 400 of them nothing. Okay. And they gave them VR training in 4 different areas: cognitive training, which helped them in improving learning and memory; emotional regulation, which is exactly what we were talking about, learning how to regulate your emotions, including alleviating stress; social skills training, which coping strategies, communication, all that kind of stuff. And then adaptability training, which is learning how to deal with the day-to-day things that happen and the day-to-day things that change unexpectedly. What they found were the 400 adolescents that got the VR training scored higher in all aspects of psychological health, which included self-regulation. All aspects. Research has also showed that VR training in adults diagnosed with depression and anxiety has helped self-regulation in all emotions, not just in depression and anxiety. Self-regulation is pretty much the difference between being the driver of your own life and like being duct taped to the roof of your car while your emotions floor the pedal. That's pretty much what self-regulation is. Self-regulation is the difference between deciding to problem solve in your relationship or having a 2-hour fight about the dishes. But you have to understand that when you display self-regulation, no one's going to applaud you. When you take that moment and take that breath before acting, no one's going to give you a medal. What is going to happen, though, is you're not going to act like that toddler who missed a nap. And honestly, those little bits of time, those little bits of self-control, and every one of those fights that you don't have is what is going to turn you against your partner into the two of you against the problem. And this is where relationships actually start to work. That is all I have for today. Thank you so much for spending your valuable time with me. I really hope that you enjoyed your time down the dopamine hole. All the research for this podcast is linked below, but it is also on the corresponding website, downthedopamineHole.com. If you enjoyed what you learned, please subscribe, hit the like button, comment. I will respond, share it with your friends, even if you don't like them. It's totally fine. I'm not picky. Please be safe. Take care of yourself. Be happy. But most importantly, keep it weird.